Everybody turn off their cell phones. This means you.
And on. Close. Okay.
Just now we make sure the sound's good. The monitor. Now we put a mic on. See how Wine has a mic. Mic. Let's go. It sounds all the way. Mic all the way up by the route.
Okay, Rabbi, you're on.
Very good. Thank you. Boker Tov, a good Erev Shabbat to everyone. And even though we are not able to judge, so to speak, which of the parshas of the Torah are more vital to us than others. And nevertheless, this week's parsha of Balak is certainly one of the central parshas in the Torah. So much so that the Gemara in Brachos teaches us that the rabbis in the Anshe Knesset Agdola, who established our form of prayer, wanted to include this parsha in Kriya Shema. Now we know Kriya Shema is Shema Yisrael, and the parsha of V'ahavta Hashem Elokecha, and then there were two more parshas that were placed in the Voyoim Shamoa and the parsha of Tzitzit. Where the Gemara says that they wanted to put the parsha of Korach in it as well. I mean, Balak. So the Gemara says, so then why didn't they? So the Gemara says, because it's too long, Torah Tzibur. We don't want to make it that the people should feel that prayer or mitzvot are a burden. So there's a concept of Tircha V'Tzibura. We don't want to make the public feel uncomfortable because of the length of the service. So therefore, they didn't put the Parsha of Balak into Kriya Shema, because if they did, it would add a few minutes. And if a person says it with great fervor, perhaps more than a few minutes to the prayer service. Now that's really a very strange statement. What do you mean they wanted to put it? Why should they put the Parsha of Balak into Kriya Shema? Why should they take the words of Bilam, which stripped of all of their beauty, he intended to be negative? Why should we give it this great place in Jewish life that it's part of Kriya Shema? In this week's Haftorah, we read that the Navi says, Ami, my people, Schorno, please remember, Ma'yoat Solecho Balak Melech Moab, what the king of Moab, Balak, what he wanted to do to you, Umeh Ono so Bilam ben Beor, and what Bilam responded to him with his words, Minashitin Varagilgo, in the entire history, Lamandas Tzidkas Hashem, so that you will know the righteousness of God. So we, the Ashkenazim, we have something called Sheish Zechirot at the end of davening. 6 things that we remember: Shabbos, Miriam, Mon, etc. The Sephardim have expanded the 6 to 10. 10 things to remember. And one of the things that they have added, so to speak, is this Parsha of Balak. To remember what Bilam said, because that's what the Navi said, Am Yisrael. My people, please remember what happened there. And because of that, this Parsha probably has a much greater literature of commentary upon it than other Parshas of the Torah. So there's a basic question here to be asked when we have this problem. What's so important here? Did the Jewish people know when it was happening, what was happening? The whole narrative is between Balak and Bilam. The donkey also has a few words to say. But it's not public. The Jewish people are unaware that Bilam is on a mountain and offering sacrifices and has come to curse them, and the Lord changes it into a blessing. The Jewish people are absolutely unaware of this. And then don't become aware until Moshe writes it in the Torah. When he writes in the Torah and they study the Torah, so then they become aware of what happened. So again, it's a very strange thing. There are, I think all of us would agree that we're much happier being unaware of things than knowing about them. When I was Rov in Miami Beach, so the local newspaper, the Miami Herald then, maybe today too, but then, was a very, very small local newspaper. The main thing was that an alligator crossed Route 2. That was the front page news. So I was completely unaware that, for instance, that there was a famine in Angola or other things in the world. Then when I moved to the New York area, so in the 1970s, if you were Jewish in the New York area, you had to read the New York Times, which was poison then, but it's much more poisonous today. So anyway, if you read the New York Times, all of a sudden I became aware of all of the troubles in the world. So if you read the newspaper in the morning, you were depressed all day because, there was Angola and South Africa and Asia and there and there. So I longed for the good old days when I didn't know anything. Here, the Jewish people are unaware of what's going on. If they're unaware of what is going on, then why in the world would the rabbis have wanted to include the Parsha of Bolok in Kriya Shema every day, to give it in a place of centrality of prayer? So there's I think a very interesting, almost a vital idea here. This is the main place in the Torah where the Torah, so to speak, describes what the outside world thinks of us. Main stories of the Torah are always internal. And what the outside world, that's peripheral to the story and the ideas that the internal Jewish world deals with. And when the Torah makes reference to it, it doesn't do so with details. It doesn't tell us about the wars of the sons of Yaakov, doesn't tell us about the rise of the Egyptian empire, doesn't tell us about any of that. It goes into great detail, though, the story of Yosef and his brothers, story of Moshe, even Paro, the Pharaoh of Egypt, is almost a peripheral character in the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. Moshe is the main actor. Jewish people are the main participants. And then throughout the desert, all the stories are the stories of the Jewish people. But there's a big world outside of us. So the Torah wanted to give us a glimpse of how the outside world looks at us. And that's the story of Bilam. Bilam is an op-ed piece in the newspaper. He's a blog. He's a podcast about the Jewish people. And somehow the Torah felt, Chazal felt, that it was so important for us to know it that they wanted to include it in Kriya Shema, so that we would not have a purely insular view of the world as being only the Jewish people, but it's a world in which the world, so to speak, interacts with the Jewish people and has effect upon the Jewish people, just as the Jewish people have effect upon the outside world. So therefore, Chazal say, if you'll take every blessing of Bilam, with the exception of Matov, but you'll take all the other words, they all contain within them a negativity that can be a curse. For instance, we have the famous pasuk, Ine am levodot yishkov, uvagoyim lo yischashov. Behold, there is a nation that dwells apart, and so it's hard to understand what it means by goyim lo yischashov. It's not considered important amongst the nations of the world because it's not numerous, very small people. Rashi says different shot completely. Rashi says that whatever the opinion of the world is, the Jewish opinion is the opposite. Rashi says, Kisheheim smeichim, when the Jewish people rejoice, the rest of the world is not happy. And when the rest of the world is happy, the Jewish people are not happy. But going lo yischashov, they never seem to coincide. We know that how true that is in the relationship of nations to the state of Israel. When I have a great ally visit us here the next week, it's not worth anything. The relationship with the United Nations. How does the world look at us? The world sees our separatism, our uniqueness, our special history. It resents it, it doesn't admire it. The people that dwells alone, they got their own rules, they do what they want. They're not loyal, they're not this, they're not that. So the Torah wanted us to realize that there's a viewpoint to us. And that viewpoint should not be completely ignored. It matters greatly. So the words of Bilam can be construed as curses, and they can be construed as blessings. And we somehow have the influence upon others, how they will look at it, how they will construe it. And that places a great burden upon us, because what we do is therefore of universal consequence, and not only of consequence regarding us. Now, in the long history of the exile, Jews rarely had a chance to be influential, even though in certain areas, Jews always were influential. In the financial area, even in the spiritual area, in religion, but certainly not in government or in major players in countries. That began to change in the 19th century. Jews became very influential. So for instance, the Rothschilds in Europe. So the old man, Amschel Meyer Rothschild, the founder of the dynasty, so he always quoted there was a phrase that was used by Eastern European Jews. There was a play on words, Lama Yomru Agoyim. Why should the nation say? In other words, one has to be careful. Because there's a big world on the outside. And that world could destroy you or could accept you. You could help it, or they would they'd refuse any help from you. So the words of Bilam, all of his blessings here, have a double entendre to them, have a double meaning. Wonderful people, Am Levoda, they can exist on their own, they live in a bubble. They have their own day of rest, they have their own religion, they have their own society, they're, Am Levoda, wonderful. Or it's an accusation. We want to have a global cooperation. We want to have a national cooperation. We want everybody to be part of it, and they're not part of it. They can't be part of it. In Eastern Europe, but there was something called Shei Pei. Shei meant Shabbat Hayom. Pei was Pesach Hayom. The Goyim used to call it Shei Pei. What did that mean? You asked a Jew to do something, you'd say, it's Erev Shabbat, I can't do it. Shabbat, I can't do it. Tomorrow night's a Malava Malka, I can't do it. It's Pesach, I can't. I remember when I was the head of the OU, and unfortunately, there were now quite a number of Jews that were in federal prisons, Orthodox Jews. So we were trying to arrange with the federal prisons to have kosher food. And that they would, or at least that they would buy the airline foods. Well, I mean, if you're in prison for 3 years, let's say, God forbid, and you eat airline foods for 3 years, that is cruel and unusual punishment. Prevented by the Constitution of the United States. So we were trying to arrange some sort of system. So you sit in front of the federal marshal there, the head of the warden, whatever, he's the head of the jail, and you try to explain to him the entire section of Yoreh De'ah, the Shulchan Aruch. So I remember I just gave him a few of the highlights. He said, "You guys are crazy. We're not going to do that for you." And I thought to myself, from where his perspective, he is absolutely correct. He said, "You mean you eat this way all year round? So this idea of Shei Pei exists today as well. So how does the outside world look at it? And one of the basic questions is, as the Meforshim who deal with this say, one attitude that the Jews can have, and perhaps should have, is who cares? What I care what Bilam thinks. The other attitude is, what are you talking about? We're a universal religion. We're such a small group. Our job is to influence, as we have, all of humanity. So therefore, what the nations of the world think does matter. Ben Gurion summed it up. In the early 1950s already, the United Nations began its campaign against the state of Israel. And the United Nations in Hebrew was called Umot Muchadot. And in modern day Hebrew, everything is contracted into an abbreviation. So it's called What does the say? And Ben Gurion, after a period of time, he said, Shmum, who cares? So I remember one of the Secretary Generals of the United States came here to Israel. And he spoke, he was trying to ameliorate the situation. So he said, I know that you say Shmum. But you should know that we're going to try and improve it. It didn't help. But I remember I then was giving a shiur in one of the yeshivas here in Israel. And one of the Talmidim said, how did he know that we say Shum? So I said, what do you mean, how did he know? It's common knowledge on the street. Anything that's common knowledge on the street. He said, no, how does he know? Right? We're talking amongst ourselves, right? In the back row of the shul, you can say Shmum, but how does the Secretary General know that that's what we're saying about it? So you have here this dilemma. What do you do with Bilam? You ignore him? You put him into Kriya Shema? So I think the tircha de tzibura here is that we made a compromise. It's too big a leap to ignore him completely. Too big a leap to say doesn't matter. On the other hand, to say that we should be governed by what Bilam says, that our policies and behavior and beliefs should be influenced by what he says, then also that's a tircha de tzibura. You're destroying the society. And therefore we have this compromise, so to speak, that the words of Bilam are certainly not in the Kriya Shema. But nevertheless, they are in the Chumash. They're heard every year. And we are therefore taught that Bilam is a force to be reckoned with. And that we have to deal with it wisely. Can't be seduced by Bilam, but you can't necessarily ignore him either. So I think that that's a perspective that is quite important for us to have as we hear the Parsha read, and we remember what Balak and Bilam conspired to do and how the Ribono Shel Olam handled the situation on our behalf. So have a Shabbat Shalom, everyone, and thank you for coming.